Hello friends, my name is Malek and welcome to my video channel. This video will be in multi-section and the aim of it is to configure and use Terragrunt for multi-environments like production, staging, and so on. As maybe you heard, Terragrunt is a thin wrapper tool for Terraform code which is using in many mid to large companies. For reach to the aim of this video, I'm gonna start from scratch by scenario base. If you are beginner, I would recommend do not lose this presentation. As I told you in introduction, Terragrunt is a thin wrapper for Terraform codes and will keep the code dry. Dry is abbreviation for do not repeat yourself. For this presentation, I'm gonna start from scratch and step by step go forward because without some basic knowledge about Terraform, understanding Terragrunt will be confusing. For this presentation, this is my agenda. I will start with using Terraform and I will describe what are providers, resources, how we can use output, and how to define variables. In continue, I will speak about a state file and backends because for understanding Terragrunt, a state file is very important. We will speak about local and remote backends. Also, we will speak about modules. Step by step, we will create a network module, an application module, and I will show you how to use them and how to access outputs through a state file in each module. And finally, I will speak about how to manage multiple environments and we will focus on Terragrunt. Let's start. What are the providers in Terraform? A provider in Terraform is a plugin that enable interaction with an API. For example, you want to create an EC2 instance on AWS cloud infrastructure, or you want to make an instance on Azure. So, how Terraform knows to communicate with that specific infrastructure? So, this happens by installing provider plugin for that specific infrastructure. As you see here on Terraform website, there are many different providers plugin for different infrastructure. For example, AWS, Azure, GCP, Kubernetes, Alibaba Cloud, OCI, and so on. So in first step, we should select which provider we need for our Terraform codes. Today, I'm gonna use AWS provider. So in first step, we should define AWS provider in our code. As you know, a provider like AWS has a lot of data centers around the world. On this map, you can see the different data centers for Microsoft Azure, Amazon, and Google with different colors. For example, in United States, in Europe, Asia, and in Australia. So we should know in which region we should deploy our codes. For example, I want to deploy my codes on data center in Virginia region in USA. So in second step, we should select region. Until now we learned At the first step, we should select provider, and in second step, we should select region. Let's open my VS Code. I have a folder with name project, and inside it, I will create a file with name main.tf. All the Terraform files has the extension .tf. Normally, we select main as a file name. It is recommended by Terraform. You can select every name as you want, but it is better follow the instruction based on Terraform suggestion. So we select main.tf. You see here our file is empty. We don't have anything on it. So as we spoke, the first step we should select our provider. As here I want to work on AWS, I should define AWS as a provider. Let's go into Google and search Terraform AWS provider. From the first result, I open it. As you see here, AWS provider. It is written here for Terraform 0.13 and later, we should use like this one. As we are using the latest version of Terraform, we are going to use this one. So I select here and back to VS Code and paste it here. The first one, select provider. Terraform required providers AWS. And going from this source, HashiCorp AWS, and will download AWS plugin on your computer. And after its installation, your computer can interact with AWS infrastructure. Let's add a comment here. This is the first step, provider. The second step that has been spoken, select region. In which region we want to deploy our resources. You see here, provider, AWS, region, US is 1, which is a collection of data centers in US Virginia. Let's save it, Control S, or going file and save. So this one is saved. How to run this code? We want to be sure this code is correct. And after that, we will go to next step. So going to terminal, new terminal, and we'll open a terminal for us here. Running this code that can install this plugin on our computer, we should run Terraform init. It will go and will initial Terraform on your computer. As you see here, it goes and find the version that we define here. Every version that is equal 4 or bigger than this version can install for me. As you see here, finding version 4.54. Install it on your computer. Terraform has been successfully initialized. Before going to the next step, it is mandatory to say something here. For communicate to each provider, we should have credential. So before continue, we should go and create our account on AWS or another provider. Here I assume that you have an account on AWS because there are a lot of tutorials about how to create an account on AWS. So I continue with this assume that you have an account on AWS. Let's back to Terraform documentation. As you see in the same page of provider, it is written about authentication and configuration. As we spoke, for communicate with AWS or every provider, we need to have credentials for authentication. When you get your credentials, you can use them in these 6 ways to interact with AWS. The first one, as it is written here, parameters in the provider configuration. It means we can use our credentials as plain text in Terraform codes. It is not recommended because if you save your code on one of the public repository, everybody can access to your account and make problems for you. So the first one is just only for tutorials. The second one is using environment variables. In Windows or Linux, you can use environment variables, and automatically when you run your Terraform code, it will read these variables and communicate with provider. The others are shared credentials files, shared configuration file, container credential, and so on. Here, I don't want to use the first one. I use environment variables. Here, you see if you want to use your credential as plain text, you can configure them here by assign your credential to this access and secret key in provider block. Or if you want to use as environment variables, you should use these 2 variables, AWS underline access key ID and AWS underline secret access key. If you are using Linux distribution with the export command, you can do it. If you are using Windows, in your Windows terminal, you can use set command. Set the variables equal your credentials. Let's continue. After we select region, now it's the time to select your network. Network, or it is better say virtual network, is the fundamental building block for your private network on cloud service providers. Virtual network enable many type of resources such as virtual instances to communicate with each other with internet and on-premises data centers. In your virtual network, you define which CIDR block you want to use. In AWS, it is called VPC, Virtual Private Cloud, or in Azure, it is called VNet, Virtual Network. How to do it in Terraform? Let's open browser, back to Google, Terraform, AWS VPC. From the result, click on the first one. Here, show you how to create a VPC. Let's copy this one and back to VS Code. Number 3, create VPC. As you see, VPC is a resource. So with the resource AWS VPC, we can select every name here. For example, main VPC. Let's remove this one. At the moment, we don't like to speak about it. Just we define here our CIDR block. So you decide which IP range to use in your network. In this example, I'm using this one. For the tags, just leave it as is, and I will speak about a little later. Let's Ctrl S to save it, and let me open another page and going to AWS console. Sign into my console. In my console, just in the search, I type VPC, your VPC. There is one default VPC by AWS. If you don't want to create a VPC, you can use it for tutorial. This default VPC has this CIDR block. Okay, let's run our code and see what will happen. Let's clear the screen. I run Terraform plan. It will show us what will be created on AWS. It is recommended before apply codes run Terraform plan. It says I gonna go on AWS and create a VPC with this cider block for you. You see here one resources will be added, nothing change and nothing destroy. So for deploy, just Terraform apply. Here we'll ask, are you sure to do this? We say yes. It will go and create resources. Apply complete resources, one added. Let's back to browser. Just refresh here. You see here a VPC with this cider block has been added on AWS. This is the tag that I told you. That tag on Terraform code assign main name to this VPC. So we can change it to every name. For example, we can use VPC tutorial, save it, and run the command again. Let's back to browser, refresh. You see it's changed. Until now, we learned how to define a provider, how to select a region, and how to define a VPC. As we spoke earlier, a region consists of some data centers. These data centers are isolated and they are physically located in separate location. This location called availability zone. These availability zones have independent power, cooling system, and also physical security. They are connected to each other with a redundant, low latency fiber optic network. There are between 3 to 6 availability zones in each AWS regions. For example, US East 1 in Virginia has 6 availability zones. As you see in this picture, for example, in one region, we have 4 AZ. AZ is abbreviation for availability zone. We bring up a server in AZ1 and also we bring up another server as redundant in AZ2 because for any reason, if this availability zone is going down, another availability zone is in service. Normally, most of the companies use different availability zone for redundant to prevent any downtime. When we bring up a server, if we don't select AZ for it, AWS select one of the availability zone by random. So it is better when we want to bring up a server, define availability zone. Maybe now this question comes to your mind. How we can get the list of this availability zone in each region and how we can use them. Let's back to my VS Code editor. As you see here, before we use this keyword resource to create a resource on AWS. For example, when we wanted to create a VPC, use this resource. So resource is a part of API to push something on AWS. So if we want to get something from AWS and show us, for example, the list of availability zone, there is another keyword that comes to play. It's called data. As you see, if I click on this one here, automatically open something like that. Keyword data, and here we should define from where and assign a name for it, and then put some command here to get which data from that resource. For example, we have created provider here and selected a region. So we wanted to get the list of all availability zone in this region. How we do that? Let's go to Google again and let's search for this one. Terraform AWS get list of availability zone. From the result, select the first one. Here you are. This is the code that we're gonna use it. Let's copy this one back to VS Code and put it here. This piece of code will provide us the list of availability zone in US East 1. Let's save it and run it. Nothing happened. Why? Let's consider why it didn't show us anything. Here there is another subject that we should mention it. Like any other programming, when you want to print out something, you should use the command print. Here in Terraform, this command called output. So we should define another block. It's called output. Just give it a name, for example, list of aces. Now, how to get output? How to print us that? There is a keyword called value equal. So what we should add here? Just copy this one from the first to end, Control C, put it here, and remove this quotation and put dot, remove this one and put dot. Save it and let's run the Terraform. Yes, as you see here, this is the list of availability zone in US East 1. 6 availability zone in US East 1. I will show you later how we can use these outputs. I think it is enough for the first part of this presentation, and I will try to forward more quickly in next part. And finally, if you like this presentation, I will appreciate if you put your feedback in the comment below. See you soon in next part.